We knew it's only a matter of time until we're encircled. I thought at that moment, like, this is it, they're just gonna gun us down. He took his police baton that he had and smacked me round the head with it, and then just continued to beat me. He was threatening to cut off my ear if I didn't tell him who were my commanders. And that's when he turned around to me and said, international law doesn't exist here.
Welcome back to another episode of Bravehearts on UATV. I'm your host, Corrie Nieto. Today, my guest, he is from the UK. He is currently serving in the DIU International Legion. His name is Aiden. He also goes by Cossack Gundi. Cossack Gundi, or Aiden, how are you?
Thank you for letting me be here.
No, it's always a pleasure chatting with you, man. And I'm glad you can stop by for this episode of Bravehearts.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so let's get right into it, okay? So can you tell me about your military experience? Because you had some military experience. I believe you were with the YPG, right?
Yeah, so I think I would have to rewind it so people don't get confused, because my whole past 10 years was quite a lot to fill. So before 2015, I was a civilian. I had no interest in joining the military. I worked in support work and also I worked in security. Fast forward to 2014, with the rise of ISIS in the Middle East and all the atrocities that started coming to light from them, I grew increasingly frustrated with the way the international scene was responding to that threat. And I decided that instead of like staying at home getting frustrated at the lack of no one helping, I decided that I would go out to Syria to at least do something rather than complain about it at home. And I'd learned about a group out there that could help me facilitate that, to go help defend people against ISIS. And then I left Syria in 2017 and went back to the UK. I tried to adjust to a normal civilian life again, but I was still struggling a lot, especially like when you've just come from that sort of environment. And I knew Ukraine had just recently, they allowed foreigners to serve in the Ukrainian military. And I already knew a lot about the Ukrainian conflict. I'd been following it from like the very first day when the Maidan protests started. And I had a very vast like level of support for Ukraine. And again, like with Syria, I was frustrated and annoyed that there's still a war going on in Europe, like not that far away from me. Like the best way to sum it up is when later on I was able to drive from my house to Ukraine, so it's not that far away for people back home. And I decided I was going to go to Ukraine again with the same moral principles that I hold, to like show the Ukrainian people that they're not forgotten, and to also do my part when others won't. So that was like the beginning of my military career in Ukraine. And in 2018, I flew out to Kiev, and September 2018, I signed a contract with the Ukrainian Marines after going through the military recruitment process, and then spent 2 months doing military training. Keep in mind at this point, like, I don't know a word of Ukrainian or Russian. So it was a lot of quick learning that was helped by a lot of the guys I was serving and training with. Unluckily for them, the 2 guys like spoke English and they got designated my translator. But I became really good friends with them and we served together for a while. And eventually, later on in my military career, I transferred to the 1st Marine Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade. And for the next four years, I served in that battalion. Initially, I was in DIU, otherwise known as Air Assault Company. Became like one of the first foreigners to earn my parachute wings, earned my Marine Beret. And then later on, I transferred to the mortar company on the 120mm mortar. And fast forwarding it to in the build-up to the invasion, we had recently been deployed to Pavlopol, which was our designated like frontline area where we'd been for the past 4 years. And we kind of like had a sense for like what was going to happen at some point. Okay.
And I know that you were with Sean Pinner, right?
Yes.
Was this with the Ukrainian Marines or?
So with Sean, I first met him back in late 2016 when I was making my second trip to Syria. We met each other in a safe house in North Iraq. and then we were smuggled across the border together, and we spent some time together there. And after that, like, we became like really good friends. And then when I came to Ukraine, like, he came, he like met his wife here, and eventually he went on to be an instructor in the National Guard, and I went to the Ukrainian Marines. And at some point, I can't remember the day exactly, he decided to join the Ukrainian Marines, came to our unit, and we continued to serve together once again, alongside like a few other like foreigners. And we became really good friends. At one point, he was our commander because he got promoted and was made like team leader of our section. And by the time the build-up to the invasion was coming around, because I was in mortars, the neighbouring company, we were still in the same like area, but I was with my mortar unit and he was with the air assault unit, so we were still like in the vicinity of each other. And then obviously when we got to Mariupol after the retreat, we managed to somehow stay in contact through like very loose like forms of communication, such as like there was one instance where I like wrote on a post-it note to give to someone from his unit to like send it to him just to let him know his wife was safe. And like since we've like been released from captivity, like we're still good friends. We still talk to each other. Like we still keep like pretty much in contact.
Sean is an amazing guy. He has an amazing story. And also he wrote a book just like you.
Yeah.
It's Live, Fight, Survive. And you have a book, Putin's Prisoner, right?
Yeah.
And I've yet to get your book yet. Once I get it, I would love for you to sign it as well, man.
Of course.
Yeah, so let's talk about the build-up to the full-scale invasion in 2022. You were in Mariupol, correct?
Yeah, so we're in the Mariupol region. We were approximately like east of Mariupol, probably like 30 minutes down the road. Based in the village of Pavlopol. We'd been deployed there, I think, at the end of November 2021, and we previously were deployed there back in the previous year and also 2019. So we knew the area very well. We knew the region, geographic like features of the area, and I think when we got there, like at like late November, even though it wasn't as intense with like the geopolitics at the time with like what was going to happen, I think there was a part of me that knew like this was coming, especially like when we look back to late October that year in 2021. The Russian forces were using the artillery system, which was again a violation of the so-called ceasefire. So I knew like late October that this was going to lead to something a lot more severe and it's going to escalate. Late October, we had the instance where the Russian side were using artillery in violation. The Ukrainians have it on camera in response due to failed communications that had been set up to try and de-escalate. Ukraine destroyed that artillery piece with the like lowest wheeled missile that they had. And in response, the geopolitical scene from Russia started escalating. A month after that incident, that's when we started seeing all these Russian echelons, like from Russia, being relocated from the far reaches of Russia to the Ukrainian border. And day after day, it just kept on building, like it didn't stop. And I think by the middle of December, that was when I made the conclusion that, like, the invasion's going to come. Like, it's no longer a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And carrying on into the new year in 2022, the scene hadn't stopped. They were still sending troops.
Where were you getting your information from? From your commanders or from media?
So a lot of my information was just from social media in general, like what was open source. Again, like the Russian side of like military secrets or movement wasn't really secret because everyone was posting about it. The civilians that were seeing the military trains like transport like hundreds and hundreds of like troops, vehicles and stuff. And then obviously there was the movement of the medical vehicles, like hundreds and probably thousands of like medical equipment. And it was at that moment that I realized like this isn't like a scare tactic. It's not training. Like they're preparing for casualties. And I think it was like just before the invasion in the week building up to it, the the front line was pretty quiet, so to speak, for us. The Russian side had been trying to provocate us into like returning fire, but we couldn't return fire. We had restrictions in place. There was a lot of incentive for us not to return fire, just because of the fact that if a position is quiet and then you receive a bonus, so there was a big incentive for the Ukrainian side not to fire, and the presence of the overseer at the time was quite a lot. You would always see their drones all over the place. And it was probably like the last few days before the big invasion that the artillery started to pick up along the front line. And a lot of people, when they were tracking what was going on in Ukraine at the time, they would have seen the Grad artillery being used in Luhansk. And it just started to get more severe from that point. And I think that the moment when the invasion started for us was probably around 2 a.m. in Ukrainian time. And I was on radio duty at the time. When I was on radio duty, I heard the Grad artillery being used. And from that moment on, that's when the invasion started. But little did I know at the time, I didn't realize the scale of the invasion.
Do you feel like you were adequately supplied for this type of invasion?
I'd say we were adequately, we were prepared for it. We knew it was coming. We just, me personally, I just didn't expect it to be as large of an invasion as they did, just for my own logical viewpoint, with it being completely a crazy idea that only a madman can make.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so they invade, and right away they're making a big push towards Mariupol, right?
So initially, on the first day, we had to relocate because the terrain we were on was unimaginable to defend properly. So we tactically relocated day after day until we reached Mariupol on the I think it was the last day of February, and by the 10th of March, we were encircled because not only were we fighting the Russian forces that were coming from us from our previous positions, we were also fighting the Russians that were coming from behind us, that were coming from Crimea. So we knew it's only a matter of time until we're encircled. Mm-hmm. And the fighting there was very severe. Myself personally, once we got to Mariupol, I didn't do any fighting per se. I mainly helped with my unit with the ammunition and making sure the guys get what they need. Mm-hmm. And just, I think the aerial bombing campaign that they had on Mariupol itself was probably the hardest and heaviest I have ever seen. In all of my knowledge of what I've seen from past conflicts recently, there isn't a good way to describe it other than pure hell.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe the conditions that you were in when you were trying to defend Mariupol?
So the conditions, we were in the Illichar steelworks, and I'd say for a lot of the guys that were manning the outer perimeter, they were in pretty dreadful conditions, but they made the best of what they had. It started to turn into a game of cat and mouse, because every time you go above ground, it's not really a thought of you need to get something. It's more of a thought of am I going to come back down? Mm-hmm. Because of the aerial bombardment. Any moment a bomb could drop. You could be seen by a drone or a jet, and most of the time you had to rush out and not spend as much time above ground.
A lot of people talk about Azovstal,
mm-hmm.
steelworks.
Yeah. But
there was another side as well, and this is what you were defending. Can you talk about the encirclement of Azovstal?
So for people who don't know, there was 3 major holdout points in the city once the Russian forces had infiltrated the city. There was the Illichar steelworks, which is where I was located, which is north of the city, and then you've got Azovstal, which was southeast, and then there was also the port, which is southwest. And eventually, when the Russians started pushing into the city, we ended up getting cut off from the holdout in Azovstal. So now the Russians had completely encircled the steelwork territory, and the steelworks themselves, it's like a mini city, so to speak, because of how big it is and how big the buildings are. And by this point, it's like the 10th of April. we've like run out of food. We've got plenty of water, but no food. And we attempted to try and make a break and fight our way to Zaporizhia the night before. And when it got cancelled, reasons unknown, but the next morning, the Russians were able to locate the vehicles that we had prepared and loaded all our ammunition into. And somehow they managed to like get exact point where it was hidden in the factory, and all our ammunition got destroyed. Obviously, after this had happened, we had no ammunition whatsoever to fight with. And due to like the heavy casualties we were taking because of the aerial bombardment, we had no other choice than to like surrender. So by this point, we're now in a second encirclement. There's no way for us to get to Azovstal, and surrender was either surrender or end up who knows what.
Mm-hmm. So was there ever a moment where you thought you might not make it out alive?
I would say there was definitely a few moments, but it's hard to put into like words, because generally when you get fear, like you normally have that sense of like try to avoid it, but at the same time, like when you're there and everything's going on around you, you kind of like just learn to accept it, and you try to carry on like whatever work it is you're doing.
Let's talk about the moments where you understood that you have to surrender. Can you talk about this? How did you know it was time to surrender?
So initially, the commander like told us that we either have like three options that we can try and attempt to like break out in whatever was left of the vehicles. Initially, I turned that down straight away just because I knew it would be pretty much impossible to drive 140 kilometers through enemy territory, especially the encirclement, to get through that. The second option was to try and walk out on foot, and I was more leaning to that. But then I asked like how many people are like leaving on foot, and they said quite a lot. And given the size of our territory and the encirclement, I figured that wouldn't be an option just because it would just be pretty much suicide. Mm-hmm. And then the third option was to surrender officially to Russian forces alongside those who are surrendering and the injured. So I chose to do that one because that way at least I looked at it as maybe like a 90% chance that they kill me, or there's that 10% chance that I survive it. Mm-hmm. And I also knew as well that those who surrendered with me would see me. I knew there would be witnesses to see that I surrendered. They saw that I was alive. Because that 90% of me thinking that they would kill me, I also thought that they would just do a lot of stuff to like basically kill me.
Why'd you think that they would kill you?
So I've learned and studied a lot about like Russian conflicts. I've studied, like I've done a lot of research into Georgia, Chechnya, and Moldova, and then also Syria. And the history with the treatment of POWs has never been good. So I kind of had an idea of what might be waiting for me, especially with myself being a foreigner. I've like researched and studied a lot of like Russian propaganda over the years because of my time in military service, and I've learned that Russian state propaganda, it's only got one objective: to throw as many narratives out into the world to confuse people. So I knew that they would be calling it all sorts of stuff. They'd previously like called us in a propaganda piece in 2020, saying all kinds of like crazy like conspiracy sort of stuff. And it wasn't until when we were preparing to go to the surrender point that my mind was just completely empty, devoid of like emotion or feeling. And I'd accepted that this was most likely my fate. But again, I was holding on to hope of that 10%, like that I will survive it and go home at some point. So before we did go, I managed to make a call to my family through the Starlink, luckily, and told my mum what was about to happen. I lied to her, said like, everything's going to be fine, don't worry. I'm sure she couldn't worry, like after I've just told her I'm going to be going into Russian captivity of all places. And then called my then fiance, who I've since split up with, called her to tell her like what's going to happen. Also lied to her that everything will be fine. And then once that had happened, took all my electronics, destroyed them, and then I scattered them around so that the Russians couldn't piece them back together to get access to my electronics. So it was probably like one of the most terrifying like situations that I've ever experienced and will experience.
How did the people in your unit or the people that surrendered identify where this surrender point was?
So initially, the most senior person that was still in charge at the time, they contacted the Russians through the radio to organize terms of surrender. And then after that had happened, they told a point where we go. We went to the point with the white flag, and just before we'd gone, they'd also asked our senior commander, like, who do you want to surrender to? Do you want to surrender to the Russian military, or do you want to surrender to the DPR? And obviously, our commander chose the Russian military. And
why did he choose the Russian military?
Just because of like legalities with international law. I mean, we were still hoping for some chance that out of everything that they would still recognize international law with the Geneva Convention. And once that had happened, we went to the surrender point unit by unit for those that remained. And in total, there's probably like maybe 1,000 of us that like surrendered that day, alongside like a lot of like the injured. And again, like one of the most terrifying feelings is like when you're heading to this point, like you're about to meet the enemy that you've been shooting at for like the past 4 years. Like it's very rare that you actually meet the people that you shoot at. So that was like another like fear of mine, is just because you don't prepare yourself for that sort of like encounter. At least not in terms of like face to face. So the guys that met us, they were from the Russian ОМОN, which is like a special police unit in Russia. At first I was a bit confused because I was a bit surprised that ОМОN are here, because it's not really their kind of work. And when we got there, everything was like sort of normal. They lined us up, checked our IDs, and then patted us down, and then they loaded us onto a bus. And when we got onto the bus, we drove for about like maybe 20 to 30 minutes to the village of Sartanor, which is another town in between Pavlopol and Mariupol, which I knew.
Did you have like hoods over your head or something like this? No handcuffs?
At this point, the treatment was pretty normal, like what you would normally expect, like when you think of like prisoners of war. And I think a lot of that was because there was cameras. So once we got onto the bus and we drove to Sartanor, we drove into one of the agricultural warehouses near the local Nova Posta, which I'd frequented like over the past 4 years. And as soon as the doors opened, they started with the aggression, with the intimidation, and we ran into the warehouse. We were then lined up against the wall, and as I was like running up against the wall, I remember seeing what I thought looked like bullet holes. And I thought at that moment, like, this is it, they're just gonna gun us down. And they lined us up and then told us to get into like a stress position, standing with our arms behind our back, leaning so we're off balance. And we stayed like in that position for 12 to 13 hours. And one by one, they took us out again to check documents. Eventually, it was my turn. And I went up to them, gave them my military veterans card. I gave them my military ID. And then I gave him my passport, which had a Ukrainian passport cover on it, but it was a British passport. So as soon as he opened it, he started flicking through and realized something was wrong. And then he said to me in Russian, "Откуда?" which is like, "Where are you from?" And I then replied like, "Velika Britannia," which is Great Britain. And as soon as I said that, he punched me on the nose, beat me a few times. But again, at this moment, like my feeling, like my emotion is like, I take it under the chin. I'm like, okay, it's the front line, it's adrenaline, like his friends are being killed, whatever. Like I'm going to accept that. Like there's not a military in the world that hasn't done something similar like that. And eventually one of his commanders stepped in, he stopped it. And then they humiliated me. They took my chevrons, put it on my head. And when I saw him take the Ukrainian flag chevron, I had an image from my research before with like following the Ukrainian conflict from the beginning. There was a Russian militia commander known as Giving, a very nasty individual, and there's a very famous video of him at Donetsk airport where he's like beating some Ukrainian POWs, and he takes their chevrons and he forces them to eat it. So when they did that to me, I had this image of that's what they're about to do to me. Luckily, they just put it on my head, and then they put me aside. And the next morning, I got taken out. My name was called. I was in tactical questioning by them, asking like who I am, like why am I here?
Did they have a translator, or were they speaking in Russian?
Just purely Russian.
How did you manage?
I've been in Ukraine now for 6 years. Again, when I came to Ukraine, I didn't speak any of the language. I picked it up and learned it all by ear. And a lot of the people in Ukraine, like they speak a mix of Ukrainian and Russian. Like none of this like propaganda that you see on Russian state media where they say that Ukraine is oppressing the Russian speakers. Like it's totally false. Like a lot of the guys I serve with, they speak both Ukrainian and Russian. So over that period of time of service in those 4 years, I learned a mix of it, and in the Ukrainian like society, they call it Syzyk. So I knew a lot of Syzyk to a degree. I've always struggled with pronunciation because like Cyrillic is a very hard language to pronounce. But I understood a lot by ear, so it made my time easier when I was in captivity because of that. And again, at like one point, like they're saying to me, like, you and Sean Pinner, like you're snipers, mercenaries, and I'm like telling them like, no, I'm like a enlisted serviceman. Like I joined the Ukrainian military 4 years ago, and then they made me like show my tattoo, my Happy Days tattoo, and unfortunately for myself and Sean, a few years earlier, like. A group of us, like the foreigners, that because we knew each other, we decided to get this tattoo in the same spot. So we all had identical tattoos, so they were able to quickly like lob us together. And as soon as this was finished, I was then put back in the warehouse with the other Ukrainians, and I immediately went up to my senior commander in the company, who was with me at the time. And I immediately just said to him, like, look, they're going to take me. I don't know where they're going to take me, but I think they might kill me. Can you just tell my family I love them? And just good luck. And a short while later, my name was called, went to the front door. They placed handcuffs on me. They took me out and put me in the back of a SUV. And as we were driving out of this compound, like, they turned to me in Russian and said, like, now we're taking you to be shot. And again, at this point, like, I'm just totally emotionless. Like, my emotion is gone. There is no like reaction that I can facilitate. The only thing that I was focusing on was like thinking about my loved ones, like in my final moments that I thought were my final moments. And then after like an hour or two, I realized like you don't drive someone like 2 hours to like then shoot them. So I figured I am now going to the next stage of captivity, and I was trying to prepare myself for what I knew was coming, especially with what I'd witnessed already. So I knew that the next stage there's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be a lot of like fear. And I was just trying to prepare myself mentally for that next stage. We eventually arrived to Donetsk, and once we arrived, I was taken out of the back of the SUV, and they took the handcuffs on, and just out of sort of respect and also fear, like I put my hands immediately behind my back, just to show that I'm like being submissive, like. And there was a guy in a blue like camouflage like uniform like stood in front of me, and he stunk of alcohol, and he said something to me, but I couldn't understand it because his accent was like really thick in Russian. And me being me, I politely asked him in Russian if he could repeat. But because, again, I used Syzyk as well, I used Ukrainian words. And as soon as I said that, like, he took his police baton that he had and smacked me round the head with it, and then just continued to beat me. I fell to the floor, and then he like picked me up and then dragged me into the building. And for the next 3 hours, I was beaten. I got knocked unconscious. And at one point, he stops beating me. And keeping in mind, like, while he's beating me, he's asking all these questions, like, who are you? Who are you with? And again, I'm saying, like, I'm a Ukrainian Marine. I, like, enlisted in 2018. In 2018, the questions, they weren't the sort of questions I was sort of expecting, like, from an intel point of view. It was just very basic questions that someone who wasn't really a professional would be asking. And eventually at one point, because every question was being like asked, and then I would give an answer, and regardless if it was me being true or if it was me lying, I would still get beat every question that was asked. And eventually he stopped himself to like have a rest, because he himself is so tired from like beating on me. And he took out his cigarettes, and I'm sat on the chair like in complete daze, because like I'm trying to like keep myself awake, because I'm at that point now where I can feel myself like I'm gonna like just black out. And he's smoking his cigarette, and he gets down, like he squats down to my level, and he says to me like, "Did you see what I did to you?" And then I was like, "No." He like points, and I looked to my shoulder, and then I realized I'd been stabbed on my shoulder, which I didn't feel, because again, I'm being beaten, the adrenaline's like rushing through me. He then asked if I knew who he was, and I said no. And he said to me that I'm your death. And then continued to ask me, like, do I want a beautiful death or do I want a quick death? And I then obviously said I want a quick death, because I can only presume with him saying a beautiful death, that can only mean something that will be sadistically fun for himself. Obviously, he turned around and he said, "No, you're going to have a beautiful death." And then he continued beating me until probably a couple, like 20, 30 minutes. They told me to take my clothes off to look at my tattoos. They saw my Ukrainian trident tattoo, which I had. They beat me for this. And then I've also got a tattoo from my time in Syria. They asked what this was, and I knew what was coming next. And I told them that I was in Syria. They beat me for that. And then they took a knife out again and had it against my neck, and then telling me like who was I with in Syria. They thought I was ISIS at the time. And then I had to explain like I was in Kurdistan, and eventually they understood and then beat me. Because the problem geopolitically with Syria and that whole charade is like, for those that don't know, the Russians, they support the Syrian regime, and the Kurds, that they're more of a neutral sort of like position, so to speak, but they're backed by the Americans. Like the American coalition like helped them significantly with like airstrikes and stuff. So as soon as I said that, they started thinking like maybe like I'm some like intelligence person and that's why I'm here. So I continued to get beat more. They took the knife out again, held it against my ear, and they said that they had someone that fought in Syria. So I presumed maybe this guy was from Wagner, and he was threatening to cut off my ear if I didn't tell him who were my commanders, because they thought I was lying. And eventually they just gave up. And again, I'm still getting beat. I lose consciousness for like a very few moments and regain. I get beat again. And eventually it stops. This Russian, I can only presume he's a Russian officer because he was wearing a Russian uniform. His uniform was like very, from what I remember, his uniform was very tidy. His boots were like polished, and he looked professional, like a professional soldier would. And eventually I just heard him like say like, stop, you're going to kill him. Stopped, and then he sat down next to me. He said, "Look, like, if you want to talk, like, we can talk," and looked at my wound. He said, like, "We'll get a medic to like give you treatment for that." At that point, I'd gone into survival mode, because I knew if I took another beating, I was probably not going to survive it, because I'd already taken like multiple blows to my forehead and like the rear of my head. And they took me into the side room, and he started asking me questions. But again, like, it wasn't the sort of like intelligence questions I was expecting. it was very casual, so to speak. Like, it was more like just my autobiography of like what I've done in life and how I ended up here. And the only two questions that he asked me that I could presume might be intel related, obviously, were, are you SAS? And mind you, back at this point, like, I'm not as fat as I am now, but back then, I was a bit on the chubby side because I was in mortars for the military vets that know military culture. And I remember responding to him and saying, like, look at me, like, do I look like I'm SAS? And he said, okay, like, that's a good point. And the second question after that was like, are you MI6 or have you had any contact with the intelligence services? And again, I just say back to him, it says like, I'm a matros, a private in the Ukrainian Marines. Like, I'm in mortars as an assistant gunner. Like, if I'm intelligence, why am I in this position? And again, he said, oh, good point. And eventually, I got put into a prison cell, into a jail cell with 30 other Ukrainians. For the next month that I was there, I would be taken out repeatedly to do further questioning by these people from the FSB. They were also pushing the propaganda. They made me do like multiple phone calls to the British government, to my family. Even at one point, Oksana Mokchenko, the wife of Viktor Medvedchuk, she had done a video appealing to myself and Sean directly, asking us to contact Boris Johnson at the time, who was our prime minister, to try and push for an exchange. And we'd already been told as well by the investigators that came to visit us that we're being charged as mercenaries, even though that everything we had told them, they had our military ID, they had our military veterans card. Everything under international law with the Geneva Convention suggested that we weren't mercenaries and we were legally protected. There was no legal protection for us in that circumstance. And for the next month that I was held there, they starved us. We got basically a tiny piece of bread, just enough to keep you alive. And we had a 2-liter bottle that we had to share around 30 people at a time, once a day. So the conditions in the jail cell were like dreadfully awful. It was very cramped. It was like a tin of sardines, basically, because of how small it was. There was 30 people. It would turn into a sauna because of the heat. And fast forwarding to June, we were then at that point, I was then relocated to the Donetsk CISO, which is the pretrial detention prison. And once we were there, I realized there's going to be a court date coming up at some point because they told me I'd be going to court. And fast forwarding to June, it's probably the week before court, and now I'm in a cell with 5 other Ukrainians in a cell that's designed for 2 people. There's no windows on the bars. It's just open element to the outside, concrete all around. We shared a bed between 2 people, and the 5th person, they slept on the floor because the Russians forced them to sleep on the floor. And again, like, when you're in this prison, like, things don't get better. Like, you're still in the system of intimidation, fear, and aggression. When you arrive to this prison, they put a bag on your head, and you basically have to crawl from where you come and go to your prison cell crawling on the floor. But the difference is, while you're crawling on the floor, the Russians, they're beating you with a prison stick, and you have to listen to the commands of where to go because, again, you're blinded, you've got a hood on your head. And just going back to the week before the court date, we knew that we most likely possibly faced the death sentence because they had spoken about it on the propaganda radio that was always blaring 24/7. And in the days leading up to this court date, we had a new arrival in the prison that arrived. And I remember at the time, we didn't really pay too much attention to it because we got used to the sound of people being tortured as they were like being brought to the cell. So by that point, as dark as it sounds, it's normal for us to like just hear people like screaming in pain and terror. So we knew there was a new arrival coming, and we didn't pay much attention to it until like 30 minutes had passed, and the guy was like still screaming, and we knew something was different this time. And eventually he got to the cell, and the guard was like telling him the rules of the prison. He then told the guys that he was with, like cleaning up, like get him sorted, help him learn the anthem. Because when you're in this prison, like everyone has to learn the Russian anthem. You don't have a choice. If you don't learn it, they beat you. So this prison was designed to take any pride or any patriotic feeling that you had and just get rid of it completely. And when he'd finished telling him these rules for the prison, he asked him, like, do you understand? And there was no response. And he, in aggressive like voice, he said to him, like, what are you? Are you sleeping? And then he started to beat him again. And all we can hear is just silence. There's no like vocal response from like any grunts or like grunting or pain. And it's just the sound of him just hitting a body. So we knew at that point, like we just stood in fear and dread on our face because we know what's happened. And eventually he finished, he closed the door, and we don't say anything to each other. Like we know what's happened. And then probably 5 minutes go by, and all we hear is banging on the cell door. And the guys that were in the cell next to us, they were shouting for the prison guard that was meant to be on duty. He wasn't on duty. He had wandered off the block. And probably like 20 minutes later, he came back and he asked them what the problem is. And they said that the new guy, like he's not breathing, like he's got no pulse. And he said, okay, went back away. And again, after 10, 15 minutes, the medic came. And bearing in mind, like, because I've been out so many times to do both propaganda, to be taken to court, to be taken to the investigator's office, I knew exactly where the medical office was. Because when I arrived, I did the crawl, and it must have been like 150 meters. But also when I had been taken out of the prison, it was that same route that we went when I first arrived, and I knew that we went through the processing area, which is where the medical office is. So the medical office was only 150 meters from where the guy who needed a medic was, and it took them 20 minutes for the medic to arrive. And when she did arrive, they again spent a lot of time like just taking the prisoners out and putting them into another cell. And then eventually we just heard the medic like say, she asked someone what the time is, and then she said time of death, like at that time. So it wasn't the time that he died. He had died like waiting for a medic to get medical assistance.
Wow.
So there's a lot of like sadistic individuals that I met there that just have pure hatred for the opposing human. And again, like there's just so much I can continue to speak, but I don't want to take up all the time, so I'll let you ask.
No, it's fine. So you were in the DNR. They sentenced you to death. And then a bit later, they came to an agreement to exchange Viktor Medvedchuk for you, Sean, some other foreigners, as well as some Ukrainians.
Yeah.
How did you find out about this, and what was your immediate reaction?
So again, like previously, like in the first week of our captivity, the first thing that they were trying to push for was for us to be exchanged for Viktor Medvedchuk, like myself and Sean Pinner. At this point, it was just me and Sean that they wanted for Viktor Medvedchuk. Obviously, that didn't go through. So prisoner exchanges, they're always very complicated because while Ukraine tries its utmost best to try and like facilitate and make these exchanges happen, the Russian side, they have no interest in doing this. They only do it if there's something that they really want to get. And luckily in our situation, Viktor Medvedchuk, for a lot of the Western viewers who don't know him, he was a Ukrainian politician who is very pro-Russian, he's very close with Vladimir Putin, so close in fact that Vladimir Putin is the godfather of his daughter. So for Putin, this was a very big prize that he wanted to get back in exchange for us. And negotiations are a very complicated matter, especially in terms of prisoners. And I kind of tried to hold hope that it was going to go through. When we went to court, we got sentenced to death. They sentenced us on 3 charges. They did terrorist weapons training because I had gone through military boot camp. The second charge was mercenaryism, which, unlike what Russian propaganda says, only carries a penalty of 7 years in prison. And then the third charge was attempting to overthrow the Donetsk constitution. I remember we pleaded guilty to the first one because we were planning to plead not guilty to the mercenary charge because we knew we could prove we're not mercenaries. We pled not guilty to the mercenary charge and pled guilty to the third one because we both, like me and Sean and Ibrahim, we knew that if we pleaded not guilty to the mercenary charge, and we managed to like show them that we're not mercenaries, and then the other charges just fall apart because of international law. And we said not guilty to the mercenary one. The whole court went into a sort of ruckus. Like, people were obviously dissatisfied with what we had said. And our lawyer at the time that we had been appointed, who was supposedly like meant to be defending us, but he seemed a lot more like a prosecutor. I remember seeing him gesturing to me like, why did you say that? And then the court went into recess and he came over to me and he was like, why did you say that? You're only going to make it a lot worse for yourself. And I said to him, it says like, look, we're not mercenaries. Like, under international law and the Geneva Convention, we're protected as prisoners of war. And that's when he turned around to me and said, international law doesn't exist here. So at that point, we realized like we just have to go with this charade, which we did. And it probably wasn't until the September, which is when we finally got released in a prisoner exchange. But in those months between the court date and that exchange, like, my mental health had deteriorated significantly. Like, the week before we were exchanged, I remember laying on my bed with a razor that I had found hidden in the cell bars of the window. And I was laying in my bed each night, like, contemplating just slitting my wrists and just, like, ending it like that. The only thing that stopped me from doing that was my friend Prebic at the time, who had been put into our cell. And he was the only reason I didn't do it, because I was afraid that if in the morning they wake up and they see that I'm dead, they might blame him, punish him somehow. I didn't want that to happen. And luckily, because of him, like, I chose not to do it. And I remember going to the window and just like trying to throw the razor like as far as I could so I couldn't reach it again. And then obviously, like, the week later, we were taken out and we were exchanged for Viktor Medvedchuk alongside 55 Russian officers. And the Ukrainian side got back myself and 9 other foreigners, as well as 150 Ukrainian POWs. So again, it was a big shock to me, because I remember like thinking to myself that like Ukraine, like, they've just pulled off like one of the best bargains that they've possibly been able to do, like, in a prisoner exchange, because of how little the Russian side got back. And it also showed that the Russian side had no care for their own troops, because they were only interested in the officers and the Viktor Medvedchuk, compared to our side, where there was a lot of privates, officers and foreigners.
Okay, so now you're a free man. So you went to Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah, so we got exchanged. When we got taken out of the prison, we didn't know it was going to be an exchange, but I'd overheard the guards like saying it's an exchange, but I still didn't process it. I thought maybe it's a trick or something, and we got put onto a truck with a bunch of other Ukrainians plus the foreigners, because I could hear like Sean and some of the other guys. And we were driven to what was the Russian border, from what I think was the Russian border. We waited there for like maybe an hour or two, and then eventually another truck arrived and they asked how many foreigners is there. We all got out one by one. We were loaded into the other truck, and keeping in mind, we've got duct tape around our eyes, like we're duct taped like this, because when we were being transported, they again put you in like a stress position. You interlock your arms with the person in front, so you can't like move about. And we got into the other truck. This time it was just the 10 foreigners. Started driving, and I can only presume we were driven to Rostov, to a FSB base, And then from there, we were then driven to Platov Airport. And I only know it was Platov Airport because when we got taken off the truck, we were led into the airport terminal. But in this part of us, like getting off the truck, like we can already hear the environment of an airport. We can, like my duct tape had come up a bit. So if I did that, I could look out. And I knew we were in Russia because of what I could see. And I knew we were in an airport. So I was thinking it's either going to be that we're being transported deeper into Russia, or it's possibly going to be an exchange, because I remember a few years before that Russia and Ukraine had facilitated a prisoner exchange where they flew the exchangees back on airplanes. So I was thinking maybe we're being flown back that way. Once we got into the airport, we were now in the area where you go in immediately after you get off the plane. We can see the passport customs officers, and then there's just this big like poster that says like "Welcome to Platov Airport." And while I'm like looking around, I can see some guys in the distance wearing like traditional like Saudi like dress like attire. So I'm pretty sure this is an exchange. They took off the duct tape, took off our duct tapes around our like hands, and the whole like attitude completely changed. It was just really normal. We were being escorted by Russian military police. They didn't say a word. The Saudis didn't say anything to us straight away either. And there was this man in the background that was walking around. I didn't know who he was. He was wearing a suit, and there was a woman. And I think at one point, I think it was John, who was one of the other Brits, and Sean, I think they were talking that he looks like Roman Abramovich, but I think it was more like he's like a lookalike. I didn't have any clue who that was because I don't follow football. And a few hours go by, and eventually one of the Russian MPs, they pick up the comms device, and they say to someone in the background that they received him. And then as soon as we heard that, they then told us to stand. We had to like stand with each other, like interlinking our arms, and they led us outside, and they said like, "You're going to follow my commands. Do exactly as I tell you. If anyone doesn't do exactly as I tell you, you're going to get tasered." We got loaded onto one of the airport terminal buses that you normally get on to board a plane, and we're driving on the tarmac, and we can see this lone plane like just sitting there. It's just a lone passenger plane, and like I'm starting to believe now that we're actually being exchanged. And eventually the bus stops. We're in front of the gangway to the plane, and I remember like climbing the stairs as we were like taken out one by one. And as we got to the top of the stairs, there's like Saudi officials in suits, like I presume were security, that just quickly patted us down. And then we went in one by one, and we were like led to like the sort of like luxury lounge area of the plane and sat down. One of the representatives from like the Saudi government, like they're saying like, "Don't worry, like you're fine now, you're going home. We just need to wait for the plane to take off and leave Russian airspace, and then we'll be safe." The doors closed, like we're all sat down, and I'm like looking around. I'm still like fearful because like, what if something happens and we end up like staying here? And then eventually we take off, and we're in this like pretty shock phase. Like we can't believe it's happening. And as the plane's taken off, there's all these like Saudi like men in black like uniforms and stuff, and we can smell someone smoking a cigarette. And I just remember like gesturing to the Saudi security guy, like does he have a cigarette? Because they didn't speak English. And he like got his cigarettes out and started like handing them out. And that's when we knew like we're safe, because like he probably would have beat us if we were not going to be like released. And then we eventually left like Russian airspace, and they told us that we'll be like landing in Riyadh in a couple of hours, and then you'll be taken to a hospital and all that.
Wow, man, that's an incredible story. So you became a free man,
Yeah.
And then you lived as a civilian for a while, and then you decided to rejoin the military, right? What
Yes.
motivated you to come back?
So initially, obviously, because when we got to Saudi, we were then flown to Britain to be reunited with our family. I tried to return to Ukraine like pretty early on after I'd spent time with my family. Obviously, because of a travel ban that had been placed on me in the EU when I got captured, because Germany were fearful that someone would misuse my passport and try to enter the EU, they put it in good faith, but it took like 6 months to get it removed once I was released. As soon as it was released, I drove to Ukraine in my car, went and reported to my battalion to like do the paperwork for after captivity, and eventually a month later, when I quickly went back to Britain, I came back. I decided we want to stay in Ukraine permanently. I lived in Lviv for a while, and bearing in mind, like after captivity, like I had very severe mental trauma from it. It took me like a year to like fully recover. And it wasn't until like last year, around January time, I had gone back to the front to work with my friend Rebecca, who's an American medic. And I was planning to do a documentary with her because I'd previously done one of my own like YouTube style documentaries from our time before the invasion. And then I'd also previously in the 2 months before been to the Ukrainian prisoner of war camp for Russian prisoners. And I was planning to do like the third episode to like film what her work is. But as soon as I got to where she was and I got back into the mindset of being back on the front line, I knew at that moment, like, this is what I want to do. Like, I just want to stay here. And that's what I did. And then fast forwarding to April, I messaged one of my friends who was serving in the DIU International Legion. And I said, look, like, I want to join, but like, I'm not mentally ready to go back to fighting now. Like, again, I've like suffered with like multiple issues. Like one of the biggest ones was stress eating because of the starvation, panic attacks and stuff. And I said to him, like, can you like find me a position where I can still help Ukraine and still do something, because I miss the military. Like, I've lived it for 4 years. Like, and not only that, like, the war's not finished yet. The war is still ongoing. While I was released, a lot of my friends who were also released, they also chose to go back to service. And when you're a prisoner in Ukraine and you get released, you have the option of cancelling your military service and you can return to civilian life. The vast majority of my friends who I serve with, they chose willingly to continue service. And I thought, for me personally, that it would be wrong for me to do that. The war's not finished, it's still ongoing. So I'm going to continue to stand by my moral principle to do what I've continued to do and love for the past like 6 years, continue to support Ukraine and serve. And I chose to sign a contract with the DIU's International Legion. And since then, like now, I'm doing a lot of like publicity, media work. I'm also a driver in my team. I help them with whatever they need to replace, or if anything gets damaged or destroyed, I help facilitate it quickly. And I'm like pretty shocked with like how good it was, because previously I've always been very wary of foreigners. But when I joined it, it really changed my opinion and showed me that like positive stuff is actually taking place and it's happening, because if it wasn't, I wouldn't be here. And I can only hope that for the future, like we continue to develop our skills, we continue to develop our like allies, and we eventually see like a victory day.
You know, it's really great that you're still here in Ukraine and your job is not done. So yeah, thanks for having a chat with us. I wish we had more time, Aiden, because you have an incredible story, and I hope to get your book one day.
Thank you.
Putin's Prisoner, for anybody out there that wants to purchase a book. So thank you so much, Aiden, for joining us. Continue doing what you're doing. Stay safe. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.